summary of all the concepts we have been dealing with in this class, okay? And I'm going to do it in English so that you get the information also in English. What are we studying here? Linguistics. What is linguistics? Linguistics is the scientific study of language, okay? And since language is one of the most complex phenomena that human beings is what defines us, what makes us human, it's very complex. And in order to study linguistics, and we don't even have a definition of what language is. We saw in this class that we have different conceptions of what languages are and how we should study them and define them. We have from the formalists, like Noam Chomsky, which is the most important linguist in the formalist side, who consider that language is pure form and we should study the formal mechanisms that make up language without considering why or what we use language for or how we use it or the meaning. And we have the functionalists, and we saw Dan Everett as one of the representatives of the functionalists, who defend that we shouldn't study language just as form, because the forms of language are produced by the function, by how we use, by the meaning, by how societies are not dependent totally in the culture, are dependent on the people who use. So we don't even know what language is and how to define it. We don't even know how to define language, okay? Because it depends on your perspective. We can give different definitions of language. And even this concept that people should sort of have clear, which is dialect, different varieties spoken of a language according to the place, we don't even agree. And that is one of my favorite definitions of language, is that a language, a standard language, is the dialect that has an army and a navy, that has power, okay? And the dialect has become, but what people speak, what we all speak, are really the dialects, no? Different. We all speak in a particular dialect, but we have also a large variety. And one of the topics that we have studied in this class and that you are investigating in your project is how Spanish is very different in different. It's not the same here in Andalusia, in Sevilla, it's not the same in the north of Spain, it's not the same in America, and we still saw that, for example, in Spanish, we have two main varieties, the most conservative varieties of northern Spain, and the more innovative varieties of southern Spain, Canarias, and also all of America, okay? Now, so in order to study such a complex concept and such a complex idea as language that makes us human, in linguistics we have many different subdisciplines, many different branches of linguistics. And this is what we have been dealing with basically in this class, no? We have two of them that take care of sound. These two study the sound of languages. The first one we call phonetics, and the second one we call phonology. And now we have dealt with what is the difference between phonetics and phonology. For me, the best way of looking at the difference between phonetics and phonology was given by an American linguist who is called Kenneth Pike. He's one of these functionalist linguists. In fact, was the teacher, the mentor of Dan Everett. And he gave a very good analogy, a very good metaphor. He said, okay, phonetics is the study of sounds. It's like the study of sounds of raw ingredients, no? All the sounds that can be produced in all the languages of the world, okay? And now the phonology is you take these ingredients and you cook them in a particular language, and you give them shape, a form, and you organize into a nice system that allows the speakers of the language to communicate, okay? And so this Kenneth Pike make a very important distinction that still is used in anthropology and in many other sciences, which is the ethic versus the emic perspective. In the ethic perspective, studied by phonetics, phonetica, and this one would be from phonemic, from phonology. In the ethic perspective, we study all the sounds of the languages and how they are produced and how they are transmitted and how they are received and interpreted in the brain. And in the emic, in the phonological approach, we study in a particular language what kind of systems do we have. For example, in Spanish we have 5 vowels, in English they have 12. In Arabic they only have 3. So different languages of the world take these ingredients that we can all produce as sounds of the languages and use some and don't use others. So we saw, for example, that some languages use clicks in their words. Other languages like Spanish or English don't use these clicks, okay? And so this is what phonology studies. We will see later, because now I'm just all the units and what we study in each of them. But morphology is the other main branch that we have studied here in this class. Is we take the phonemes, we take these units, and we go to the place where we have for the first time a unit that has a meaning, okay, which is the morpheme. We study those units that have meaning, and we study how they combine with each other to form the words, okay? So in morphology we study the word formation, how words are formed in the different languages. Now, once we are at the level of word, we have studied syntax, and in syntax we studied how these words are put together and what are all the possible mechanisms that explain how we form grammatical sentences, how we form sentences. So in syntax we are at the sentence level, okay? And this is all we have reached. We didn't have too much time to study, but it's interesting that we know at least of these 2 branches that they are both concerned with meaning. What these forms of language, what are they talking about? What is the relationship to the world? What is the relationship to reality? Okay, and why, in the same way as we had 2 branches to study sound, now we have 2 branches studying meaning, okay? And how are they different? The 2 branches of linguistics that study meaning are semantics and pragmatics. In semantics, we study the meaning of words and sentences out of context. The meaning that they would have, for example, in a dictionary, or the meaning that they have out of a particular context. If I say the word table, I have to use table to refer to a particular kind of object. I cannot say table to talk about a chair, okay? So that's the meaning of table. If I say the teacher is here has a particular teacher has a meaning, the verb to be has a particular meaning, and it's those meanings of sentences and words that out of context. In pragmatics, we deal with all the aspects of meaning that take context into account, okay? And in pragmatics, we have lots of phenomena, because we have the phenomenon of deixis, the phenomenon of pronouns, the phenomenon of all the non-literal meaning of sentences, everything that has to do with non-verbal communication, which is also very important. So in pragmatics, in the beginning of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, with the formalist approach to language, we didn't deal too much with pragmatics, but in the last 30-40 years, pragmatics has become one of the most important branches of linguistics, and is incorporating more and more areas of interest. Unfortunately, we didn't have too much time to deal with this, okay? Now, those are the core areas of linguistics. But since linguistics is very complex and language is very complex, we also have what we linguists call macrolinguistics, or linguistics in relationship with other disciplines, with other sciences. And we have sociolinguistics, which is the study of language in different societies. That's where we study language contact, the different variations of language according to register, to dialect, to all. We also have history of language. We know that we have a language nowadays, but the Spanish that we speak nowadays here in Sevilla, 2,000 years ago, was called Latin, okay? And Latin evolved and became Spanish. So languages are changing constantly, and this is something that we have dealt a lot. Now, this is an emerging field in linguistics. It's called biolinguistics. It's the confluence of biology and linguistics. You know that in biology, they study genes and how the evolution, and so there are some people and some research groups trying to work on the origin of language, on how language evolved, and how, if we know about the genetics of language, how can we help people who have pathologies of language, like mm, like aphasia, or like people who are autistic disorder and they have some problems with language. How can we explain what's going on, or people with Alzheimer's disease, okay? We also have psycholinguistics. You know, psychology studies the psyche, the individual, the psychological processes. When we study psycholinguistics, we study what's happening in the brain when we process language, how we understand language, how we produce language, and also a branch of psycholinguistics is usually neurolinguistics, because all these psychological processes take place in the brain. And this is probably one of the most interesting branches in linguistics right now, the confluences of the study of the brain and how the brain holds and how language is organized in the brain. And now we know very little about the brain, okay? And especially we know very little at the level of the most complex functions and the most complex cognitive processes like language. So neurolinguistics. Now we have language acquisition, which is usually also called, sometimes is considered a branch of psycholinguistics, is how children, when you are a child, in the process of a couple of years, 3 years, you learn a language and you can become a native in a particular language. And that's opposed to how when you become an adult and you try to learn a second language, that's a very difficult process that takes you forever and you never manage to become a native of the language. Okay, what's going on there? How do children acquire language? This is what we study there. It's also an amazing field. And now finally, we have all what we call a whole area of applications of applied linguistics. What is linguistics good for? Now in the movies, we have this movie in Sevilla called The Arrival. And in The Arrival, we have a linguist who is called to try to apply her linguistic knowledge to interpret, to try to understand, to try to analyze the language of aliens who have come to the earth. Okay, so linguistics potentially can be very important. And here I have all the different branches of these applications of linguistics, these applied linguistics. The first one is what we call clinical linguistics. It's linguistics applied to pathologies of language. Okay, we have aphasia, as I said before, children who have some language development disorder, like stuttering or some, and how do we apply the knowledge that we have about linguistics, about language, to try to help these patients improve, okay, and get rid of the language pathology. Then we have forensics linguistics. This is equivalent to what in English they call CSI, no, criminal investigation, but applied to language. Sometimes it's important to know if we have a recording of someone who killed someone or an accident, or try to determine if that voice belongs to a particular person. So voice identification. Or if we have a text, a written note, for example, from someone who committed suicide, it's important to know if what is written there belongs to the person who committed the suicide. If we think that was suicide, or maybe it was a murder, so we have to find out, no? So it's important that we have techniques to know if a particular text belongs to a person, was written by a person or not. Or imagine in cases in the court of plagiarism, no? When there is a claim that someone has copied the text of another person. We have techniques to try to find out if that text is original or that text has been really copied from another text. Okay, this is what they do in forensic linguistics. Now, probably the most important of all the applications of languages, of linguistics, is to the teaching of languages. Since thousands of years ago, we have been teaching languages. People have had the need to learn second languages. You all have learned Spanish or have learned English as a second language. And when you learn a second language, in a sense, you are applying linguistics, because teachers should be well trained in linguistics, should know about the grammar, the comparative grammar of the two languages, so that they find a path they can help their students learn more successfully. Another application of linguistics is what we call interpreting and translating. No, there are many translators who translate novels or books from one language to another, or you have people, when you have international conferences with people from many different countries, you hire interpreters to give a simultaneous translation, interpreting of what's going on, so that everybody understands everybody else, okay? And translators and interpreters have to know a lot about linguistics, especially about comparative grammar, so that they can render good translations. We also have lexicography. What is lexicography? Lexicography is linguistics applied to the creating of dictionaries. Have you ever, dictionaries can be very good or they can be very bad. And it depends on the lexicographers, the people who have organized information, and so nowadays, probably the most important application of linguistics is computational linguistics. The new technologies of applied to language study. It's also called natural language processing, and this is revolutionizing our world, because the whole of internet, Google, the big companies, they are all doing computational linguistics because they want to automatize, they want to create robots that can understand us. They want to, and so in order to be able to do that, you need a lot of knowledge about linguistics, okay? We did this estudio de caso, which I'm going to ask for in the exam, verbos de movimiento. Remember that, I have a video recorded about this, I'm not going to insist on this. But then, these are the main branches of linguistics. Now let's start little by little. I don't have too much time, but I will try to give you at least a sense of the main concepts that you need to know. In phonetics, as we said, phonetics is part of the speech sciences, okay? And in phonetics we study the sounds, how sounds are produced, how they are transmitted, and how they are interpreted in the brain. And we have these concepts. General phonetics studies phonetics for all kinds of languages. Applied phonetics is applied to teaching, applied to forensic linguistics, applied to clinical linguistics. Then this one, speech technologies, is applied, is computational linguistics, as we said before, forensic linguistics. But now we didn't deal too much with this. The most interesting for us are the three branches of linguistics that have to do with language and how we study it, no? Remember, we have three different branches. One was articulative phonetics, the other one was acoustic phonetics, and the last one was auditory or perceptual phonetics, okay? In articulative phonetics, we have to take into account the International Phonetic Association that created the International Phonetic Alphabet, or in Spanish, Alfabeto Fonético Internacional. This is a set of symbols that we use to be able to transcribe any speech from any of the languages of the world. So they have captured there all the possible sounds that all the languages of the world have. And in order to do that, we need to study how the sounds are produced. We don't have time to see how we paid a lot of attention to the glottis, which is located in the vocal cords, in the larynx, because that's the place, through the vibration of the glottis, is where sound is produced. This is where phonation or sound producing through the vibration. And then that sound, that sound wave, is modified in the resonator of the oral cavity, nasal cavity, the nose, okay? And we create the complex kind of sounds that we use in language, okay? And what we have to study is the kind of sounds that we have in the languages of the world. So according to the state of the glottis, if the glottis is closed and there is phonation and there is vibration of the vocal cords, we call the sound voiced, in Spanish, sonoro. If there is no vibration because the vocal cords are open, there is a space in the glottis and the air goes by, the sound is voiceless, like s, sh. Now voiceless sounds are usually consonants, okay? Then we try to study all the different types of sounds according to how we produce them and the place where we produce them. And we had stop plosive consonants, which in Spanish we call oclusivas, when we have a total interruption of the flow of air, and R explosion. In Spanish English we have P, B, T, D, K, G as the main stop consonants. Then we have fricatives. In fricatives we approximate the articulators, and when the air is coming out there is a friction and there is a sound, okay? In Spanish we have fricatives like s, f, f, okay? When jota, okay? These are the fricatives, okay? And an affricate, which is the che in Spanish, che, 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 is a combination of a stop plus a fricative, okay? That's an affricate. Then we have oral sounds and nasal sounds, according to whether we let the air go through the nasal cavity. Now I'm speaking in a nasal voice because I have opened the nasal cavity, and you can hear that all my vowels sound very funny because I'm producing nasal sounds. Lateral is the sound, usually the L, because we place the tongue, we interrupt the passage of the air, but we let the air go on the sides. La, 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 la. Okay, that's a lateral sound. Now, approximant, which are also called glides, it's these sounds that are not vowels, no consonants. So they are also called semi-vowels, semi-consonants. And basically, they are the E and the U, but further up than the vowels E or U. Okay, so they are semi-consonant, Now we also have, according to the mode of articulation, the way we articulate the sounds, we have what we call tap or flap, in Spanish vibrante simple, ere, ere, pero, pero, pera, versus the trill or vibrante multiple, where we have perro, perra, okay, this is a different mode. Now we have finished with all the manner of articulation. Now we have the place. Where do we produce the sounds? According to where we produce the sounds, we have different places of articulation. The first one, as we have here, is bilabial sounds, labiodental sounds, dental sounds, interdental, retroflex. In retroflex we don't have any in Spanish, they have many in Chinese, for example, but you have one in English, they have one in American English, is the R, red, red, red. When you pronounce, you put the tip of the tongue backwards, and that's why it's called retroflex, red, red, okay? Alveolar is behind the teeth, in the alveolar ridge. Palatal is further back in the palate, in the soft palate, in the hard palate, sorry. Then velar is in the soft palate, is further back, like ge, ka, ka, ka. These are velar. Uvular is at the end of the palate, okay? Perro, perro, ra, 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 ra. That's a uvular sound. The French have it. We don't have it. Pharyngeal is further down in the pharynx cavity. In Arabic they have the sound. We don't have them in English or Spanish. Glottal. This is sounds, consonants that I make in the glottal, in the glottis. Here you have in English and also in Andalusian Spanish the aspiration, like the he, her. That's glottal. And also what you call the glottal stop, which in English is in words like Clinton, Clinton, button, button. Okay, this sound, this is a glottal stop. This appears because it's easier to pronounce these sounds, okay, and it's relaxed, it's a weakening of the sounds, and that's why in Spanish we have many, in Andalusian Spanish we have the many S's that become glottal and they become aspirated. Okay, now here we have how you define vowels, and we saw that we had open and closed vowels, front and back vowels, also central vowels, and rib rounding vowels made with the rounding of the lips, like U, O, okay, versus I, E, A. But now, important phenomenon is that when we are speaking, we cannot help but having assimilation processes that explain that are explained by co-articulation. When I say a word like mano, because I have an M and an N, and I have in the middle a vowel sound, the A becomes nasal. And that's because of co-articulation. So we can have a co-articulation that can be nasalization, ovalarization, palatalization, labialization, and that explains many of the changes historically in time, because with these active articulations, sounds start to vary and you can create new sounds. For example, to give you an example of palatalization. In Spanish, we only have the two nasals in Latin times, M and N. M and N. Nowadays we have M, N, and we have a palatal one, ña, la ñ, okay? Now, why do we have ñ in Spanish and we didn't have it in Latin? Because whenever the N was followed by an E, like begonia, it becomes palatalized and it becomes ñ, okay? And now, once you have, that's happening nowadays in English, you have words like onion, that if you pronounce very fast, you say onion, and if you say canyon, you pronounce very fast, you say canyon. If English developed many of these words like canyon and onion, like it happened in Spanish, in the transit from Latin into Spanish, and all other Romance languages, you will get an ñ in English. Okay, that's how we got the ñ, by this process of co-articulation, of having a nasal, an alveolar nasal that was palatalized. Okay, so that's articulated phonetics. We try to explain how we produce the sounds of the language and try to define them, try to describe all of the possible sounds that we have in a particular language. Then we have acoustic phonetics, because we know that sound is a wave, no? It's a wave that is transmitted through the air, through the vibrations of the particles of the air that are stirred because of this energy that is created in our larynx, in our vocal cords, and that's projected out of us, and that's what's going to reach our hearer, and it's going to be able so it's a signal, no, that is transmitted through the air. And there we didn't have too much time, we just need to know what is the amplitude, which gives us the intensity, what is the time, how long, if it's short sound or long sound, what is the frequency, which is the number of times the vibration of the vocal cords is taking place per second, and this is the fundamental frequency. We saw that women have a higher frequency than men, and children have even a much higher frequency, and that's measured in hertz, no? In cycles per second, number of vibrations per second of this, and that's basically it. In auditory and perceptive phonetics, we went to see an exhibition, which is in the Casa de las Ciencias, and so we managed to see how it works, the auditory. I don't have time to go into all of this, just remember the visit we did to the exhibition. Now it's important, the last thing I'm going to deal with in phonetics is what is called suprasegmental, so it's the levels that go beyond the phoneme, that affect the syllables, that affect the word, that affect the sentence, no? And there we have notions like stress, where we have a stress syllable in a word, or the stress in a whole sentence. Then we have what's called in English tone, or the prosody, no? Of the different, in this sense we have tonal languages in the world, like Chinese, where they use the tone to distinguish words in Chinese. In Spanish, if I say ma, they are all the same. But in Chinese, if I say ma, it means mama. If I say ma, it means horse, I think. If I say ma, it means, I think, hemp, type of fabric. If I say ma, so you see different tones. I have ma, ma, different four different words. Okay, that's a tonal language, and you can hear. If you hear Chinese people speaking, you realize immediately the tonal nature of the language. Okay, and that's important from this perspective. Also, We have intonation. All languages use intonation, and they can use it linguistically or non-verbally, okay? And we have pauses. When we are speaking, when we are thinking about a new word, or when we make a mistake and need to go back and try to use another word, we make pauses, and these pauses can be empty or they can be filled, like with or with or with or different languages can use this differently, So we have these different type of pauses, and finally we have speed, rate, how we speed, the tempo of speaking can be, and the phenomena are different. If I have a lot of time, I say in English, actually. But if I have no time and very fast, I say actually, okay? Because I go very fast speaking, okay? And very important, that this is in red because we paid a lot of attention to this, rhythm. Rhythm is a combination of all these, the intonation, the stress, the pauses, and each language have a specific rhythm. And we saw that a language like Spanish has a rhythm based on the syllable, because all the syllables have the same duration and there is no difference. But there are other languages like English that are based on the stress. Okay, the stress syllable, it takes up almost all the duration, and you hear English and you hear it as a succession of stressed syllables. And the stressed syllables have they are a lot longer than the unstressed syllables. In Spanish, no. Stressed syllables are a little bit longer, but not so much as in English. And that's why in English, most of the vowels in unstressed syllables are reduced vowels, and they become schwas, they become unstressed. Okay? Okay, that's basically phonetics. Now, what did we do in phonology? Remember what I said about Kenneth Pike? In phonology, we take these raw ingredients, or these sounds that we have studied in phonetics, how we produce them, how they are carried out in the sound waves, how they are interpreted in the brain, and now we study what different languages do with different sounds and how they organize into phonological systems, okay? How they cook them, how they use them to give to be able to give meaning to particular words, okay? And here, one of the most important notions that we have studied is the concept of phoneme, okay? What is a phoneme? Phoneme is a unit of linguistics, a unit of phonology, that is the minimal unit in linguistics, okay? That we use to be able to, it doesn't have meaning on its own, but we use it to make differences in meaning when we go at the level of the morpheme, that we will say later. Now, so phoneme is an abstract unit, and different languages organize their phonology, their phonemes in different ways. We saw that in Spanish and English, and just as an example, Spanish has 5 vowels, 5 phonemes, English has 12 or 13 according to the line, it depends on the dialect of English. And other languages, like Arabic, only have 3 vowels, okay? And now in consonants the same. Some languages like Spanish we saw has 18 consonants, if it's the variety spoken here in Spain. In America it's 17, because they don't have the distinction S, okay? They don't make that distinction. So different languages organize their phonological system in different ways. In order to study that, we have the concept of phone in English, which is just sounds, no? And these sounds are organized in what we call allophones. We know that each of the different phonemes have a set of particular manifestations in the speech, no? So the example I would like to give is the word dedo. We have 2 Ds at the phonological level, 2 phonemes, the phonemes are the same, de, do. But when we pronounce it in Spanish, because of how language has changed, etc., we say de, do, and we pronounce 2 different allophones. One of them is occlus, a stop consonant, de, very similar to the one in English, but the second one is a different phoneme in English. It's the of they, the. Okay, so in Spanish, this de and this de are the same phoneme, they are allophones of the same phoneme, but in English they are different phonemes. So you see how different languages organize this phonology in different ways, no? And then we also saw the concept of minimal pair. I know that Spanish have the phonemes L, R, R, these three liquids, because I have minimal pairs. I can say pelo, and it means one thing. I say pero, and it means but, no? It means a different word. If I say perro, it means an animal, okay? If you go to Chinese, you don't distinguish this, you don't have minimal pairs, you don't distinguish three different phonemes there. In English, if you go to the vowels, if you say beat, bit, bet, bat, but, bot, boot, you have different words, okay? Because you have minimal pairs that give you different meanings, okay? Now, we use two different types of phonetic transcription, one that we call phonetic and the other one phonological. In phonological transcription, we just record the phonemes. In the phonetics, we go deeper and we go to the particular, and we express all the allophones, okay? And we did some practice on that, phonemic transcription. We also talk about the natural classes of sounds, okay? So, for example, when we make a classification of the sounds of Spanish, we have natural class of vowels, 5. Natural class of consonants, 18. In consonants, we can say, oh, which are the stop consonants of Spanish? 6 consonants, and they are the same as in English. B, P, T, D, K, G. Those are the 6 stop consonants, okay? Now if I say voiced stop consonants, B, D, G, okay? So this is a good way of classifying the sounds and make classes. We also dealt a little bit, although we didn't have too much time, with what we call phonological processes. The most important one is assimilation. Okay, as I said, mano, assimilates, get the characteristic of being nasal because M and N are nasal. We have assimilation, what I explained earlier about ñ. Ñ was originated in Spanish through a process of assimilation. The N became palatal because it was followed by a ni that was palatal. Dissimilation is the opposite process, okay? When we have two different sounds, two similar sounds, we try to make them different. And I'm gonna give you an example. In what nowadays is hombre. In Spanish, in Latin was hominem. And I'm going to try to explain what happened, and in order to illustrate many of these phonological processes, what happened from Latin into Spanish. The first thing was a deletion, una eliminación, a deletion of the h. In Spanish, we don't say ha anymore. We write it, but we say hombre, okay? Now, the second one was other deletions. Okay, so it's normal in languages that sounds become eliminated. So for many centuries in Spanish, when Latin go into Spanish, hominem became omne. Okay, that was in the medieval times, for many centuries, this was the Spanish word for man, what we call nowadays man, hombre. Okay? Now what happened here? And here is where dissimilation took place. Here we had a nasal and we had a nasal. And somehow people didn't like that and change the nasal, the second, the N, into an L. And started pronouncing hombre. Okay, so omne, by dissimilation, became hombre. Okay? And now what happened? How did we get the B? This was through this process of epenthesis or insertion of a sound. If you start saying hombre, very fast, the B appears automatically. Because of co-articulation, you go from the stop consonant, which is bilabial, which is nasal, to a non-nasal, and automatically you have the B. Hombre, 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 hombre. It's automatic. So that in that way, this B through epenthesis appear. So you see all these phonological processes explain how languages change in time. So we have assimilation, dissimilation, weakening, strengthening, deletion, epenthesis or insertion of a, and you also have metathesis. And metathesis is, we see it all the time in lapsus linguae because you have a word like cocodrilo in Spanish nowadays, but in Latin it was crocodilum. Crocodilum. And this is what we have, what you have in English nowadays, not crocodile. This in English you have crocodile. Now, why do you have in English crocodile, but in Spanish we have cocodrilo, when they are obviously the same word? It's because of metathesis. It's very typical that R sound changes places, it changes position, okay? And so we have cocodrilo instead of crocodilo, which is what we should have had if we had kept the sound in its place, and because this is where it was in Latin, okay? So we have this metathesis. And then we have this vowel reduction. Many vowels are reduced to schwa, for example. This is very typical in English, okay? And in Spanish we don't have it so much. Then we have the concept of syllable. And the concept of syllable, we studied that in a syllable we have a structure, no? Remember we saw this is a syllable. We have the onset, and we have the rhyme, and in the rhyme we have the head or nucleus of the syllable, and then we have the what we call coda, which is the final part of the syllable. Okay, so all syllables are built like this. Okay, and in different languages, syllables can be more complex or less complex. Spanish is a language with phonotactics, with these combinations of sounds into syllables, which is not so complex as in English. In English, we have very complex syllables like sprints, okay, where we have 3 consonants before the nucleus, the head, before the vowel, and 3 consonants after. So we have a structure of consonant, 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 vowel, consonant, consonant, consonant. This is impossible in Spanish. So when we borrow a word like sprint, we have to say spring, okay? Because we cannot pronounce this. And in Japanese, which has a phonotactic even that are more simpler than Spanish, they borrow this word and they say supurintu, and they make 5 syllables out of it because they cannot have it in 1 syllable. Okay? See, these are the phonotactics. We also dealt with that. Now, when once we finish the domain of sounds, we go to what we call morphology. We take these syllables with these phonemes, they combine, and finally we have units that have meaning. And that's what a morpheme is. Morpheme is the minimal unit of linguistics that has a meaning. Meaning is that refers to something outside of itself, refers to a reality. Okay? And again, as we saw in phoneme, we had phone and allophone. And allophone in morphology we have the same. We have morphs and we have allomorphs. Okay? For example, in Spanish, the S morpheme to indicate plural has 2 allomorphs, the S and the ES. And they have a different distribution. We have this appears when the word ends in vowel, this appears when the word ends in consonant. Okay? In English, because of contact from English to French, it also, and Latin, it also developed a plural with S. But the allomorphs in English are different. In English, because of the phonetics, of the phonology of the language. In English, you have that when the sound ends in a voiceless, the word ends in a voiceless, you add a voiceless S. But when it's voiced, or it's a vowel, or it's a voiced consonant, you use this allomorph, okay? You have S, Z, but when the word ends in a sibilant, which is a sound that is fricative or affricate that is very similar in sound to the S, then you are forced by your language to use an is allomorph. Okay, so that's why in English you have S, Z, is as allomorphs of the morpheme of the plural morpheme. In Spanish we have two only. Okay, because English is more complex in the phonetics here. No, it has more affricates and more fricatives, and it would be then very difficult to have many words that end in fricative followed just by an S. You need is in order to be able to distinguish the plural. Okay, so that would be the difference between morpheme and allomorphs. Then we have bound morphemes and free morphemes. Bound morphemes are the ones that always appear next to a root. Free is independent roots, independent words. Then we have affixes. We have suffixes, prefixes, infixes. Then we have roots, and we have also bases, and we have grammatical morphemes, lexical morphemes. Okay. And this is very important, this is why it's in red. We have lexical categories, noun, verbs, adjective, adverb, but we have functional or grammatical categories, like pronouns, determiners, auxiliary verbs, conjunctions, etc. And then we also dealt with, because one of the main areas of morphology is how words enter in a language, how they are formed, and that's what we call word formation processes that give rise to neologisms. And we studied the most important ones are derivation and composition, compounding, okay? One that's called zero derivation is what we call conversion in English, okay? And it's the process where you have, for example, a noun, fish, this is a noun, and automatically in English, without doing anything, you have to fish. So that's conversion. Notice, compare this or moon, the planet, the satellite of the Earth, to moon. Compare this to Spanish. Luna, and now if you want to go and land on the moon, you say alunizar. Okay? Alunizar. You add a prefix and a suffix. In Spanish, if you have pez, pescado, you use the verb pescar. Okay, in Spanish, we cannot do so easily this conversion or zero derivation process. What is moon?
Es que el verbo to moon no es to ir al moon.
No, but coming to land in the moon, you cannot to moon the moon.
No.
Okay, well, to moon is when you están en el limbo, ¿no?
No, es
Negativo.
es una acción negativa.
Es cuando una persona para un broma quitar sus pantalones y mostrar
Al
sus
revés.
traseros.
Y
Vale.
es como la luna, y por eso es to moon.
Vale. Lo que hace Shin-Chan en los dibujitos esos animales, ¿no? Vale. Estados Unidos es to moon. Pero creo que también significa to land in the moon, ¿no? ¿Okay? No lo usáis vosotros, pero yo, pero bueno, en español sería
En
alunizar.
español sí.
Vale. Bien, okay. So we have also a large class of processes that are called shortenings. And in shortenings we have acronyms, which in Spanish we call siglas, and we have clippings, we have back formation. Remember we even did an exercise where lots of examples of these back formation processes, okay? Like cherries, cherry, okay? Like peas, pea, okay? Because they become clean, ¿vale? In Spanish, because people think something that they thought was a morpheme really was not a morpheme, okay? We have blendings like branch or smoke or we have many where we get the beginning of a word and the end of the other. Now very important also is all the long words and borrowings from one language to another. We also made the distinction, I didn't put it here, but it's important, préstamo versus, or long word versus calc. Okay, here we take the form and the meaning, here we just take the meaning, okay? Préstamo is football, becoming football in Spanish. Calc is football, becoming balompié, okay? Because we have translated the concept into Spanish, but we have borrowed the concept from English. Onomatopoeia is when we imitate words from sounds, no, and we take it into the language. We say in Spanish we say cocorico, or kikiriki. In English you say, well, yeah. In Spanish we say wow, wow, wow. And in English you say wolf, wolf, wolf. No, these are onomatopoeic sounds. We also have folk etymology, where people invent the word because they make it similar to a word that has a particular origin. We also have these important processes of taboo and euphemism, whereas we are incorporating new words constantly, okay, because some words become dirty. Like I gave you the example of Spanish butter. No, this was originally was water in English, butter, but this butter became dirty because of its associations, and nowadays butter we try to avoid it in Spanish, and we have baño or servicios, and we are creating constantly new words, okay? Also another one that is taboo nowadays, or people don't use it, retrete. But retrete originally was retreat, a secluded place, a place out of the way, was the bathroom. Nowadays we cannot use retrete anymore because it's dirty, okay? So that's a process that makes us invent, create new words, all the kind. All the politically correct language that we have been speaking about has to do with euphemisms, okay? To call reality with names that are nicer. Okay, the most important thing in morphology was the distinction between inflectional morphology and derivational morphology, okay? In inflectional morphology, as opposed to derivational morphology, there are three main differences that we study. One is that inflection doesn't change the category. If you have a verb, you say alunizar, alunizar. We don't use it too much, but now that I have created this word, alunizar, I have hundreds of words through inflection. No, I don't change the category. I say, yo alucinaré, no, alunizaré, o yo alunicé, o el hombre alunizó la Tierra en 1968. Okay, so in inflection we don't change the category, we don't change the meaning. That's the most important thing. It's usually placed in the periphery of the word, at the end or the beginning of the word, total, whereas the derivational morphemes are applied closer to the base, to the root, and the inflectional morphemes are more productive. If I have alunizar, I have all the words that are associated by inflection. I have 200 words. However, some suffixes or prefixes that are derivational, they can be more productive or less productive, okay? Now we have here some examples of flexion, no? In Spanish, in nouns, we have gender, number, case in some other languages. In verbs, we have person, number, tense, aspect, mood, okay? It can be quite complex according to language. Spanish has a lot more inflectional morphology than English. We saw that, no? In English you have the verb to love, you have love, loves, loved, loving, and that's it, 4 forms. In Spanish, if you have the verb amar, you have hundreds of different forms, okay? So different languages derive, and finally, in syntax, we saw different visions of what syntax is. We compared that with Chomsky and Everett, no? Formalist linguists think that syntax is the center, the most important part of linguistics, and that we have to study how we form the sentences algorithmically, and we don't have to care about the meaning, whereas functionalist linguists think that the meaning is the most important, that the form is created by meaning, not the opposite, okay? And so in syntax, we studied the notion of constituent, and in order to determine what the constituents of a sentence are, or in the syntax, we use these tests for constituency. Movement, we move from one place to another constituents, we don't move things that are not constituents. Distribution, we study where they appear. We did the same in morphology and phonology to try to discover the phonemes and morphemes in order to discover what are the constituents, what are the different parts of a sentence. we study the distribution where they appear, okay? We also use proform pronoun substitution to see what is a constituent, and also coordination. We can coordinate constituents, but we cannot coordinate non-constituents, okay? And very important distinction that we also dealt with is functional categories versus which are closed class versus open classes or lexical categories. We already saw this in morphology. And lexical categories, noun, verb, adjective, adverb. Functional categories which are closed, prepositions, determiners, articles, auxiliary verbs, conjunctions, and pronouns. Okay, and these are closed functional classes because they have grammatical purpose, grammatical meaning, whereas the open categories or lexical categories, they take us out of the language to a different reality. Now, when we describe an adjective or an adverb or a verb, we are talking about actions, about objects. Okay. Now, important distinction is grammatical versus non-grammatical sentences. No, because our whole purpose in order to create the grammar of a language is to be able to distinguish what is possible in a language and what is not possible. Okay, and that's why we have all these rules in the informal languages. But we didn't have time to deal with everything and all the phenomena having to do with Concord and with we didn't have time to do a lot of syntactic analysis because this is just an introductory class, but we paid a lot of attention to the concepts that allow me to build sentences. Okay, so we centered in the verb and we talked about the concept of valence of the verb, which is if I ask you an example, what is a valence? Okay, it's a concept in linguistics that was borrowed from chemistry that indicates that for a particular verb, how many elements, how many participants do you need to make a grammatical sentence in the language, okay? So if we have a verb like rain, the valence is 0 because I don't need anything. I just say it rained and I don't need to add any participant, any semantical, only an it, because the grammar in English requires that you have an obligatory subject, it, okay? But that's not a participant because it doesn't refer to anything. It is raining, okay? If I have a verb like die, the dog died, I only need one participant, so the valence of die is 1. If I have a verb like devour or eat, the valence is 2. I ate something, I devoured the steak. If I have a verb like give or put, now the valence is 3, because for give or put, I need 3 elements. I need to give, I need the person, the giver, the gift, and the person who is given. I gave the present to my mother. Okay, I present mother. And put is the same. I put my phone on the table. I cannot say I put my phone. I cannot say I put. I have to say I put the phone on the table. I need 3 participants, even though one of them is a location, is a locative. Locations I can have in any sentence, but the difference is that with put, the location is obligatory. In the other sentences that I said before, it is raining. Location is not obligatory. It's obvious, no, that it's raining somewhere, but I'm not forced by the syntax to state the location. Even when I say the dog died, it's obvious that the dog died somewhere, but I'm not obliged to say the dog died on the street. If I say I gave my phone to Kelly, I'm not forced to say I gave the phone to Kelly in the classroom, okay? But here's the difference. If I say I put the phone, now I'm obliged by the syntax to say where I put the phone. And that's important in the concept of valence. It's those elements that are obligatory. And so we have verbs with valence 0, valence 1, valence 2, valence 3. Beyond 3, there are no verbs, okay? Then we studied the concept of the argument structure or thematic roles, and there we studied all the possible functions, semantic functions that we need to fill up these roles that I need, no? And there we talked about notions like agent, which which is the person or the animal that does purposefully, willfully, an action. We also have this concept, which is like an agent, but it's a little bit different, which we call experiencer, which we use for psychological verbs, like love. No? When I say I love you, I is not an agent. I is an experiencer. Experiences, or I like you, I am not an agent when I like something. Because it's this something that causes me to like. Okay? It's the stimulus that causes. That's why I cannot say that I purposefully or willfully do the action of liking or loving. It's something that happens to me. Okay? That's why we call and make this distinction between agents and experiencers. Then we have themes or patients, but we use the term theme, which is any object or any person that is affected directly by the action of the verb. Then we have beneficiary. Beneficiaries we only have when we already have agent and theme, and we need a third participant that receives the benefit or damage from the action indirectly. That's the beneficiary. Then we have locations and we have instruments as other thematic roles. In other theories, but we don't have time to, that are more functionalist, are more oriented to space. They talk about goal, origin, and they talk about other kinds of thematic roles, but we don't have time. Then we dealt with probably the most formal of all the categories that we have studied in this class, which is the concept of subcategorization. This concept comes from Chomsky linguistics, from formal linguistics, and it's a new way of talking about what we traditionally call transitive, intransitive, bitransitive verbs. It's a way of making categories of verbs. And in this case, we do it formally. We have a verb, and we determine how this verb is constructed into a verb phrase. And what do we need obligatorily? If I need a noun phrase, or I need a prepositional phrase, or I need a sentence, or I need a noun phrase and another noun phrase, like in English, I gave Mary the book, where I have two noun phrases, and they are both obligatory, okay? So each verb belongs to different of these categories, okay? And that's what we call subcategorization of the verb. And it's very important because it helps us. When you learn Spanish, for example, or you learn English, it is not enough to know a verb and know the meaning. You have to know how it is built, what preposition it takes. If you take a sentence, if you take two direct objects, or you take a direct object, indirect object, and you have to know how to build the sentence in order to be proficient in the language. So that's why subcategorization is really, really very important. Subcategorization of the verbs, very important. Okay, we already saw the thematic roles of agent, theme, beneficiary, experiencer, locative, instrument. And we also have related to them, because they are usually connected, what we call grammatical functions, which is the function of subject, direct object, indirect object, and object of preposition. And then the final thing we saw in syntax was the question of, once we have a particular sentence, a particular subcategorization for a verb, how, and this is the most important thing in syntax in my opinion, because it gives us the flexibility. We are not forced to tell the things, to build sentences in one way. We have different operations in different languages to present the same event from different perspectives. So if I imagine an example, I throw my pen to the window and the window breaks, no? I have a choice. When I tell the people here, the owners of the window, I say, oh, I broke the window with the pen. Or I can say, no, the window broke. Or I can say, the window broke on me. Or I can say, oh, the window was broken by someone, I don't know who, okay? Or I can say, no, the pen broke the window. You understand? So I can present the same event in different ways. And that's why we talk of alterations of the diathesis, of the way we present these semantic roles in the syntax, okay? We come up to the active, where we present the agent as subject, the theme as object. I broke the window. But I can opt for the passive. No, the window was broken by someone, I don't know who, okay? Or I can do the impersonal. Oh, here it happens, no? Windows break here easily, okay? Or I can have the reflexive. The window broke itself. That's a joke. But or I can have reciprocal. Or I can have the I want to say I broke the window, but I can say no, Kelly, the students made me break the window, okay? And that, now I'm adding a causative. And in Spanish we have this funny one where we can involve another participant indirectly, even though it's not directly participating in the action. And you can tell me, or Carmen Grajera or someone here can tell me, oh, por favor, no nos rompas más ventanas, don't break more windows for us, no, because that affects us, because we have to pay the windows, okay? So we have all of these operations that gives us a lot of power. And now, in semantics, we didn't have time to deal with semantics and pragmatics, unfortunately. All I want you to know about semantics and pragmatics is that they are branches of linguistics, disciplines of linguistics that deal with meaning. But they deal with meaning in a different way. In semantics, we study the meaning, the linguistic meaning, the meaning independently of the context. And in pragmatics, we study the meaning in context. Because in context, words, the meaning of words can vary a lot, okay? And the same word can have different connotations, different values, different uses, and pragmatics is very important. Unfortunately, in an introductory class, we didn't have time to deal a lot with this. In semantics, it would be important if you knew this principle, the principle of compositionality, and that's very simple, is that the meaning, imagine that I have a sentence with 3 words, no? The meaning of the whole sentence depends on the meaning of each independent word and how it is combined, okay? So that's the principle of compositionality. This is basic. But sometimes it doesn't work very well, especially when we have non-literal language and metaphorical language, and we have some funny things going on. Like, for example, I'm going to give you an example. If I say the word diamond, okay, and I add an adjective to diamond, and I say expensive, or I say cheap, no? I don't know if there are cheap diamonds, but imagine a small diamond that is cheap versus an expensive diamond. How do I get the meaning of cheap and diamond, the meaning of expensive and diamond? By combination. I take, oh, these are diamonds, these are cheap things, the cheap diamonds are the intersection of cheap things and diamonds, okay? And probably the category is very small. Now, expensive diamonds, there are many more expensive diamonds, is this combination of things that are expensive with diamonds, okay? So I combine the meanings. But now what happens when I say fake diamond? Now it's very strange, no? Because what is a fake diamond? It's a diamond that is not really a diamond, no? So I cannot do a composition there. You understand? Because now, in order to define fake diamond, I have to go out of the category of diamond. Say, oh, it's something like looks like a diamond, feels like a diamond, but is not a diamond. And that's why this principle of compositionality in some moments might have some problems. And finally, there are meaning. In meaning, we don't know what meaning is. Okay? We have different approaches to meaning. We have the psychological approach to meaning, which says that meaning are the mental images, the concepts that we have in our mind. We have the linguistic meaning, which is blah, 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 because it's all circular. The meaning is the relationships that were established with each other. So we have antonyms, synonyms, and out of all of these relationships, we get the meaning of words, okay? That's linguistic meaning. And we also have a kind of philosophical semantics that tries to compare meaning to reality. So if I say, for example, there's an elephant in this class, you might say, no, wrong, that's false. okay? Because you compare, there is an elephant in this class with the meaning, you say, oh, there is no elephant in this class. That's false, okay? So you compare the sentences with the word and try to declare if reality holds with your sentence, okay? That's the philosophical meaning. But I don't have time. If you like the subject and want to read more about linguistics, I encourage you to explore more deeply these topics. And this is the end of the summary. Okay.